On September 16, 2022, a 22-year-old Iranian woman named Mahsa, also known as Jina Amini, died in a hospital in Tehran, Iran, while she was in the custody of so-called religious morality police. She was arrested a few days before that for not wearing a proper hijab. A remarkable uprising has started since then. Mahsa's death resulted in a series of protests described as the largest Iranian protest since 1979 revolution. Many brave women removed their hijab on the street in Iran, and many around the globe, including well-known faces, publicly cut their hair in solidarity with this uprising and as acts of protest. Despite the brutal suppression by regime, shutting down the internet, arresting journalists, killing innocent women and men protesters by firing into a group with live ammunition or by beating them with baton, the movement has now, and after 40 days, gained another deeper and wider momentum. And these days, we are witnessing an astonishing phenomenon happening in our country, Iran. Dear audiences and forever friend of Berkeley Lecture Series, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from anywhere you join us today. As always, it is a true joy and pleasure having you with us. We are having a special guest during a very special and unique time you're living at. Neda Toloui-Semnani is a journalist, writer, and producer, most recently with Vice News Tonight, where she won 3 Emmys. Neda was born in Iran, grew up in Washington, D.C., and now is based in Berkeley. She holds a Master of Science in Gender and Social Policy from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a Master in Fine Art in Nonfiction from Goucher College. Her work has appeared in numerous publications, including New York Magazine and Washington Post, and she's been also featured in Rampus and This American Life. They Said They Wanted Revolution, a memoir of my parents, is her first book. Welcome, Neda.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
What a time.
I know. What a time. An interesting time.
Yeah, I can't imagine more appropriate time to talking about your book.
Thank you. I mean, the title, everything. I don't know. Yeah, it's one of those things, a coincidence, but also, I guess there are things that you can look forward into history and sort of guess what's coming.
Yes, absolutely. So just before we started, I have our first question and how long this meeting will be. So our usual routine is to have a 45 minutes of talk and then 45 minutes or maybe a little bit longer based on our program for Q&A. So please feel free to write your question in the Q&A section in Farsi, in English, in Pinglish, and then we go through them one by one as long as time allows us. Neda, just the floor is all yours.
Oh, thank you, Shima. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you guys for having me. I feel like so many of the people here probably I either tried to get a hold of for this book or kindly sat down with me or know somebody who did. So since we're talking about Berkeley, I thought I would start with a reading from a section sort of early in the book when my mother was just transferring to Berkeley from San Jose State, and she was looking for an apartment. On that first day in Berkeley, she walked hurriedly down Telegraph Avenue. She had a quick, funny gait, heels in and toes out. It pitched her hips back and forth in a way that was a little tomboyish and a little suggestive. She found the sublet, which belonged to a young couple who were visiting Iran for a few months. The apartment was essentially a small room, but my mother took it to share with another Iranian girl I'll call Naz, who was a few years younger than she, the little sister of a friend. The girls moved into the studio with a love seat, milk crates, a phone, and a turntable. They slapped fat, psychedelic flower decals on the walls and pulled down the Murphy bed to share. That summer, their apartment was where everyone gathered on their way to Iran House, the meeting place for all the ISA chapters in Northern California, a couple of blocks away. Do you remember falling for your friends? Do you remember the rush of it? Do you remember the delight of it, the relief and the joy of it? The feeling was, of course, of course. The feeling was one of being found, finally, found in a way that made you realize you had been lost, floating aimlessly in a too big world. The feeling was, I'm not alone, not any longer. I am not a freak. I am accepted, and I accept in return. Life became an exclamation point. The blood sang, and the heart expanded. So it was for my mother, and so it was for my father, and so it would be for me. When my mother found the ISA, the Iranian Student Association, the Iran House, and moved to Berkeley, she felt an acute sense of well-being, happiness, and complete fulfillment. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel depressed, quiet, and watchful. She felt exhilarated. Months passed. It was now fall. The afternoon my parents met when my father and Bijan were hoping for tennis, and my mother was in her apartment going about her day. She didn't know her next thing was coming. My father was walking to her, probably taking all the political pamphlets handed to him along the way. He may have nodded to the people he recognized on the street where she lived. Bijan was a good friend with my mother, new friends with her, even though it felt as if they had known each other for several lifetimes. He and she had talked about playing a match that day, so knock, 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 he was there to collect her. Now my parents met formally, though they must have recognized each other from Iran House. They leaned in, a kiss on both cheeks in the Iranian way. That afternoon, my father was wearing a light yellow polo shirt. He was in graduate school. He had a kind American girlfriend with long, dark blonde hair. He was 3 years older than my mother. He was intense with a big laugh. My mother later said that he wasn't tall, but he was broad and sturdy, built like a soccer player. At that time, my mother still wore makeup. She still ironed her tight, kinky curls, trying to force her natural afro into straight locks. She was quick-witted and warm. She had a full lower lip. My mother put on a kettle for tea, or maybe she reached into the refrigerator for beer. The members of the ISA could still drink then. This would change over the next months when the ISA began to morph from a collective of young Iranians coming together for community into a collection of political factions whose leaders started to impose rules over how people could and how people should and eventually how they could behave. The three of them talked. Perhaps one of them dropped a record on the turntable, a melodic background to their conversation. They talked, the hours slipped away, and then somehow it was night, too late for tennis. So perhaps they decided to stay at my mother's and they made dinner and shared wine, or maybe they went out to burgers. Maybe they talked all night, not just my parents, but Bijan too, into the early hours of the next day. After my mother died, I found a picture in her wallet of these friends taken during those early days of their friendship. They're in someone's apartment. My father and Bijan are sitting next to each other in wooden armchairs with black leather cushions. They're both sporting sideburns. Bijan's head is tilted slightly back while my father's chin is down, so he's looking up at the camera. Both men are seated with their hands on their thighs. They aren't smiling, but their eyes are shining. My mother is standing between them. Her hip is cocked slightly and her hand is on my father's chair. She is wearing a striped mini dress with a crocheted belt and a long navy jacket. Her legs are tan, and though she is petite, her legs are long. Her hair reaches below her shoulder. Her smile is warm. They are perfectly young and beautiful. The other friends are around them, all smiling or about to speak. My mother's roommate, Naz, is standing towards the back. Her hair is twisted up in a chignon, and she is halfway through a laugh. What does it mean that this is one of the pictures my mother carried in her wallet? What does it mean that she took it with her everywhere until the day she died? I know that was a long passage, and I hope you guys will forgive me. It felt important to start there, partly because of the moment where we're at, and I felt myself getting a little bit emotional when I got to the line where they were perfectly young and beautiful, because I just thought about all the kids right now who are what's happening in Iran. Sorry, forgive me. I don't.
Don't worry, Neda, is that is the same for every one of us. So just like, I think that you're speaking for every one of us.
Heart is big. But it's good to be around people that I can talk to about this and who understand. So the talk that I was going to give, which I still think is important to at least touch on, and I don't want this to be too serious, too stringent a talk or a lecture or anything. I mean, far be it for me to lecture people here on the revolution or Iran or any of that. So I thought where I might be able to give people some insight is by talking about the importance of collecting stories, like the stories of my family and of some of you who ended up in this book. So the other day I was having coffee with a young Iranian journalist. He's very talented. He's about 25, and he isn't the first, and I'm sure he won't be the last young Iranian who's reached out to me with his own questions. And with that feeling of seeking and trying to figure out where he belongs between Iran and America. And especially as somebody who collects stories and reports, that feeling of who I belong to, where I belong, what values should I be collecting becomes big and becomes almost, a painful kind of question to be walking with. And I made the case, which is a case I'm going to very briefly make to you guys, that he and I are in a unique position. In some ways, certainly children of the revolution who left or were born right around the time of the revolution feel this acutely, but it's true for those who are much younger than I am as well. This idea, and it's not a new one, most immigrants are children of immigrant families, first, second, third generations, feel neither one nor the other. So neither Iranian nor American. And I call what we are, and where we live, actually, in sort of a third country. So if there is America as an unmovable force, or the United States, since the Americas are obviously quite big, but the United States is an immovable force, and Iran as an immovable force in some ways, then my generation, we, and those of us after us, and even I'm sure some of you will relate to this, we are like water. We have to find our way through. And I believe we have our own history. And I believe that it isn't being collected as I would like it to be. And I think one of the arguments of this book, one of the arguments I keep making throughout this book, is that our stories are history. And indeed, we can't understand the present until we have collected and studied the past. And I do think it's important to be collecting, oral histories and biographies and memoirs for the very well-known, from the power players. But I am more curious about those of us who have been pushed and pulled sort of at the whim of countries, of empires, of rulers. And I think I would argue that part of what we're seeing is in Iran now, but not just in Iran, this feeling that people have when they have been pushed and pulled and used for so many decades. There is anger that comes from it, but also, generations are reborn. Humanity is constantly reborn and rejuvenated. So people whose memories are shorter are willing and often, stumble into mistakes of the past. Or not necessarily mistakes. I don't want to say mistakes, but fall into the same patterns of the past. So I was looking at where I thought there were communities who were in danger of being lost and forgotten. And, to be fair, many of whom were lost and forgotten. And I started looking at the WPA, the Works Project Administration, which was a unique and kind of extraordinary program under the Roosevelt administration. And within that, there was the Federal Writers Project. And this is just an example of how I think that diaspora communities like ours should consider or think about collecting our stories. So the FWP, there were writers, journalists, artists, photojournalists. It was the Great Depression, so many out of work academicians and lawyers, and on and on. Their job was to go around the country, essentially, and collect stories from people in temporary, with the Dust Bowl, for example, or folklore from deep down in the bayou, or there was Zora Neale Hurston, who was walking through Florida collecting stories. And then obviously this has become, in some ways, a practice in the 20th century in the US. And part of that is journalism. But a lot of that is anthropological and sociological, but also has to be a place for that becoming part of the nonfiction canon and nonfiction literature. I think that one of the things that we as a diaspora community can do let me back up. Since my book has come out, people have been incredibly kind. Most people have been incredibly kind, and they've said very nice things about the book. But also, and this is the part that I found quite moving, is they've said one of three things, and sometimes all three. One is, we didn't know this history. We thought we understood the Iranian Revolution. We thought we understood the hostage crisis. We thought we understood American-Iranian relations. And this is a new history that we didn't know. And of course, for me, this is a history that on some level formed me, that I grew up with. As I said, many of you probably who are in this room, or at least know people who have very kindly taught this history to me. So that was something for me to know, that this history isn't something that is well known. And this, of course, I found fascinating. But they also said, the second thing that they said was, my mom or my dad or my uncle or my aunt or my whomever won't talk to me about what happened before. That there is a culture of silence among certain groups within the diaspora, and perhaps a lot of the diaspora. And I think that's well earned. And that's something I also talk about in the book. It's, at the end of the day, we only have our stories. People can take everything else away from us, but we only have our story at the end. And it's hard once you tell your story. The other thing is that you're giving it into the world, and people can have their own ideas of it. People can understand it or not. And, of course, there is also an element of, there's a huge element of trauma in our community. And so I understand the feeling of not wanting to share. But on the other hand, there is a hunger among people in my generation and younger to know, not just where we came from in terms of knowing Iran, but how did we get here? What is our community? What are the fractures? What are the things that bring us together? And how does that make me? Because that is the question, after all, that leads all children, to make their own decisions. It's led you all, it's led me, certainly, and I'm sure it'll lead my son as well. And then the third thing that people said, which I could not tell you how much it made me excited and proud and eager to see what is coming out, is this idea where people have said to me over and over again, I'm going to go and interview my parents or my khale or my uncle. And it's not just Iranians, which feels really exciting to me. I was a guest lecturer at a class on trauma and public policy at the University of Chicago last February. And there were two people there who had been at some point Iraqi refugees. And they had spent a lot of time talking about how they weren't ready to talk about their story. But I argued in that class, and I argue now, that by telling our stories, by writing it down, by sharing it, by teaching each one of these stories, not only are we validating it, but we're bringing it into, it becomes not just news, but it becomes history. And that is something that people can grapple with. That is a mark that you leave that lasts beyond you. And it's something that people can go back to and study. And I think in this moment in time, as a journalist who has covered presidential administrations since Bush, and then certainly the last since Obama and the Trump administration quite closely, and Biden as well, I think one of the things that is so striking to me is how much of the world is in flux. I don't mean in terms of geopolitically, although certainly that. I mean, there are so many people who are moving across time and space who are taking their homes with us. And this is something obviously our community knows and is deeply familiar with. And one way that we can move through the world is by taking home with us. And that is by not just jotting down the stories that have come from before or telling our stories to the future, but it's by really claiming, as I say, this third country, this water element that is our nationality as diaspora. And so that is what I hope this book has done, and I hope it helps inspire some people to keep doing. And then, I'm going to close this part by saying, years ago, or just telling briefly the story, years ago, Trump had just been elected. I wrote a piece for the Washington Post, which was not particularly important outside of the fact that I felt a great deal of fear. This is very early in the Trump administration, might have even been before he took office, that America had elected somebody that had shades of despotism, that was surrounded by sycophants and was the demagogue. And the things that I felt so afraid of, I felt that I came by honestly. I am a child of revolution. I lost a community and a country and a language and a culture to revolution. And I wasn't sure where we were going. So one of the things that I was thinking about and sort of discussing and grappling with was this line, which sometimes people credit to Mark Twain. I don't think anybody really knows. If somebody does, please let me know, is that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. In other words, sometimes we have moments in history that it's almost like it reminds you of something else. It feels like deja vu, but it's imperfect. As I said earlier, you feel like you can see the same things coming down the line, that there are reflections of the past in the present. And it can be disorienting and it can scare us. It can scare both the person who is experiencing this history for the first time, but it also can scare those who had survived from the last, sort of from that first moment in history, if that makes sense. And I think that fear of what if we make all the same mistakes again is an understandable, but it's a question that I think is limiting. And I think now, looking at what's happening in Iran, for example, I'm torn consistently, as I'm sure many of you are, between what does another revolution mean, and for this country who has gone through so much over the past 100 years, and this people, our people who have gone through so much over the last century. What does it mean for those of us now? And then what does it mean for those of us 40, 50 years in the future? And one of the things I argue is by collecting our stories now, the diaspora stories from my parents' generation, from my generation, we can start thinking through why people have made the decisions that they made, not why rulers have, or not why presidents have, but why those of us that decided to support one faction or another made those decisions. And within that, perhaps there's something unifying, perhaps not, but it's a history that deserves recording, and it's a history that deserves grappling with. So my work and this book is an attempt to get something down before it was totally lost. And it was an imperfect attempt, obviously. Both of my parents were gone, and my grandmother was gone. I had many family members still alive, and thank goodness my mother was an archivist in the way that she kept records. But it was, so I did the best I could without some primary resources. And the questions that I put down in this book feel very specific to my family, to myself, my family, and our community. But again, there is a universality that goes between all the different groups within our diaspora, but also within diaspora in general. And so I hope what we'll see in the next years, early years, is people putting down their stories before they're lost, but also making a concerted effort to collect the stories that are being lived now. So why don't Shima-Jan, is it okay if I leave it there for now and you and I can start our conversation?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure. Well, thank you so much. While we are waiting, so I again encourage everyone to write down our questions or their comments for us in a language that you're more comfortable with. And we may even get a chance to open up the mic for the audiences to just talk about their question, or if they have any opinion on this. Okay, so Neda-Jan, before I go to the Q&A, I'd like to go back to your book. And there was a chapter, just a few pages, about the young man, a boy, who brought the cherry to your aunt, if I'm not mistaken. And I like to just go back to that. And I think that is kind of maybe a good link to nowadays and what's happening in Iran. And I want you to talk about it, and maybe even read it for us.
Sure. Just a couple. The reason why, I mean, I'm so glad that you brought that up. It's a section of the book, and it's a section of my mother's. My mother left very detailed interviews before she passed away at various times in her life. She talked about moments, but she left this particularly long and detailed interview about 9-10 years after we came to the US. And so it was far enough away from events where there was some clarity. She was able to tell a story, sort of, some of it repeated, but more or less linear. But it was fresh enough that the details were still there. And one of the things that she had talked about was at the beginning, within a couple years after the revolution, when somebody would die, either because they were, at the Iran-Iraq war, or, through something, that friends and family would gather. And you would have time to talk about it and to grieve them. And you would grieve them by telling stories. Again, that theme of stories that I mentioned. But then as people were being arrested and more people were dying, there wasn't time for grief, which very much reminds me of a young man, a musician, a rapper who disappeared today. And before he did, he gave an interview, which was published this morning, I think, with the CBC, where he said something similar, where he said, "We don't have time for grief." My mother was saying it with her voice very heavy with grief, saying that she was looking back with all this, with a wish that there was time, to have taken time for each one of these people, to have sat down, to be able to tell the stories of what made each one of them unique. But they were sort of balled up in this moment, wrapped up in this moment. And there was one boy in particular that she talked about, and I keep thinking about him, and I wish she knew his name. I'm sure we'd be able to find it, but anyway, one memory I have, my mother said in the 1991 interview, was about this young kid who couldn't have been more than 20, and he was secretly in love with Amne, my Amne. One day he came to our house in Tehran with a pail of cherries. He'd start washing the cherries, and I remember we were eating cherries all day long and joking and laughing. We'd be laughing so much we'd be rolling on the floor. This young boy who used the excuse of bringing us cherries from his home to see Amme, and they executed him. There were a number of them like this boy who didn't participate in Amor, who were no more than sympathizers. I've even forgotten his name now. Anyway, my mother said, that's what happened. And then she goes on later to talk about how responsible she felt for these kids, for these young men and women. And I think that weight of responsibility goes back to what I was talking about with some of the trauma and some of the pain that we feel, or that people within the diaspora feel, about sharing these stories over and over again.
Thank you, Neda. For the past 43 years, we've seen a lot of young and any age and gender people got disappeared all of a sudden without any news, being probably tortured and killed by the regime. So I think it's a common pain for all of us. And I'm sure that every single one of us has even one person in our family or in a close cycle to just, have that. One of the question is that I get is that, did you get answer to your question about your parents?
I think yes, overall. It wasn't, I mean, I do think that some of the questions probably weren't going to be answered the way, I thought they were going to. For example, there's a section in the book, there's a question that I've always wanted to ask my father, which was, why would you have chosen to stay if you knew that, that this uprising that had failed, that had been quashed, had happened? Why would you guys stay? Why wouldn't you have left immediately? Why did you, and in my younger brain, and I mean, sometimes even as an adult, I felt like he had chosen the movement and he had chosen his friends and, his comrades over his family. When I was being very, angry, and some days we can be less generous than others. And then I met with his former girlfriend, who I call Joy in the book. And she said, even back when they were, 15 years before or something, 10 years before the revolution actually happened, he had told her, I'm going to go back to Iran and I'm a revolutionary and I have to go underground. I don't have time for a family. So when I found that, it felt very validating. Like my question, like, this is a legitimate question I had, not just a young kid being like, why doesn't my dad love me best? Like, this is a legitimate question to ask. And then I was older than my father one day, which was a very strange thing, to be older than your parents. And I realized how many questions I didn't have the answer to. And I write about this towards the end of the book. I had been covering an American uprising, which we thought which was months. I remember I was 5 months pregnant and doing what's called HEFAT training, which is when you are, going to, it's often for journalists who cover war zones or, pretty dangerous, like combat zone type things. And I was in HEFAT training, very, very pregnant, like climbing around the ground, and feeling very amped, feeling very much like I wasn't going to stop covering this time in history. And, we were in a pandemic. I was very nervous about the election. And then obviously we saw January 6th. So I was right to be, we all were. And we never left. Like, I mean, obviously it's a different situation, but I made a series of decisions to stay a journalist. If I was in DC, I probably would have covered the inauguration. I'm not saying that these are right choices or wrong choices. I'm just saying all of a sudden I realized what I had known sort of all along is that we make decisions with the information that we have, and we are imperfect people. So in that sense, yes, that was like an incredible answer to finally got, which was that my father turns out was human and felt responsible and feeling responsibility.
I think that the love of the family is unquestionable, but I think that every one of us have some belief inside is so strong for us that unintentionally we are ready to compromise many things for that. And I think revolution is one of the strongest one in everything about our country, about our belief is, positive and negative part of it is one of those beliefs.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, there's a whole, I haven't quite organized my thoughts about watching people process what's happening now through the prism of their own experience with not just revolution, but more, I think, the more fascinating part is the aftermath of, and how what is happening now is strictly, I'm watching people filter it through their own very personal experiences, and it's heartbreaking, and it's, you know, beautiful as well, but heartbreaking for sure.
It is, yes. So the next question that I have is that, do you think the lead of the rising Iranian women will start a widespread and effective equality movement of women around the world in the years to come?
I love that question. It's something that I have been, it's like gives me goosebumps. You know, one of the things that I kept saying when this started in September was, I think my journalism background is, and my academic background is in gender and policy. So one of the topics that I'm consistently, I was always brought into with work to work on is gender and sexuality, and obviously kind of political movements, politics. So when this started, you know, then you look over and you see what's happening in India, for example, with the rise of nationalism in India. I mean, that's been happening for years, obviously, and the Islamophobia that is, you know, widely accepted and rampant there. So you have women in India fighting for the right to be hijabbed. And then obviously the same is true in France. Obviously parts of the US are experiencing similar things in that sense. But then you also look over and you see what's happening in Latin America with women fighting back against femicide, against the impunity of men to be able to judge, to push their lives. I look at what's happening in the US with what's happening in terms of reproductive justice and gender justice and choice in the US. And you know, one of the things I said sort of early on is I am very curious about which countries are watching what's happening in Iran and getting nervous. You know, and then there's the intersection of geopolitics with all this. Like, I think that revolutionary ideas, as everybody in this, you know, virtual space knows, ideas are contagious. Sometimes you have on the bad side, but then you also have, you know, this is an incredibly inspiring moment for people to watch, not just women, but, you know, heartbreakingly children, but young people. I mean, this, and it's not just the spilling out onto the streets and the giving up their lives and their freedom and all of that, which is huge. You have an outpouring of art, of music, of protest in terms of, there's an entire sort of genre of art and literature and music and film. And I'm so interested to see what's going to happen in the next 6, 7, 8 months and years, how this will be filtered through. And I think that we will absolutely see, I mean, my hope is that we will absolutely see reflections of this throughout transnational art and literature, and then movements. The last 3 years, not just in Iran, obviously, but around the world, there have been this kind of ignition of populist movements that aren't, you have on the one side the far right populist movements, but then you have the populist movements that are coming from young people who are demanding democracy, who are demanding a voice. And I think what's happening in Iran is part and parcel of that. And it's not, the other thing is it's not by itself. I mean, Iran has been in a process, the Iranian people have been in a process of protest for years now, 20 odd years, or maybe not less than that, but 15 odd years. And I think each one of these moments is built on the other. And this is in some ways an extension of that. And we'll see that, I think, in other countries, hopefully. I mean, American women have a lot to learn.
Yeah, no, this is very learning and hopefully.
Yeah.
So I have, I think, how about we open the mic and ask people to just ask their question, or if they have comments. I still go through the question or comments that are anonymous for very obvious reason, but if anyone who wants to speak in and ask their own question, welcome to join us. I started with our next question. Mehran, can you open your mic and then go through your comment/question?
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me, Shimajan?
Yes.
Nedajan, thank you for the wonderful presentation. As I read your book and your search for what your parents were thinking or doing, and understanding why they were doing that. And especially now that you just talked about the importance of storytelling and how hard it is for the generation that went through the revolution, or not just them, anybody in diaspora who had gone through some of the traumas, to speak out and talk, and the importance of that. And thank you for doing that. My question is, you talked about that generation, which I am one, having a hard time speaking about it. I'm going to ask you, your generation, or the folks younger than you who are born here or raised here, what is it hard for you for them, in your conversations with them, what is it hard for them to ask and talk to the revolution generation? Also, this inhabitants of this third country.
I think what, I think for better or worse, Iranians culturally have, obviously, we have a culture of respecting our elders. Then we also have a culture of gossip and storytelling, and both of those things sort of exist for better or worse in dialogue with each other. I think it's hard to, I was very lucky. Let me talk about my experience. I was very lucky. My family and my parents' friends, most of them, almost all of them, I think either cared about me enough to sit down and talk to me, cared about them, and they wanted to talk about it, or they felt like for some reason they needed to sit down and talk. And so I sort of encountered people at various places. And what I felt was really hard was when I felt like I was getting towards something that somebody didn't want to talk about. Nobody has to, tell me their deep, dark traumas. It's not fair for me to demand it. It's not something I can demand, but it's also, I'm not a therapist, for millions of reasons, it's not fair. But what I found was I had to get over my deference and my assumption that people wouldn't answer questions, as opposed to asking questions like, how did your family feel? I mean, something that feels so basic, I can't think of a perfect example, but something that felt basic, but somehow like trespassing into like towards the more tender parts of people's, stories and histories. And then I think it's hard. You don't want to see people that you care about upset. And so I think it's on the one hand, you have to sort of push people, sometimes need to be pushed to go there because it's human nature not to want to hurt or hurt yourself by remembering things that are really hard. But I think that there is, I'm certainly not the only person that said it. There's a healing to telling our stories and to taking ownership of our stories. And I think to be able to sit down with people who love you, who care about you and who are curious about you, and tell them where you've come from and why you've gotten to where you are, and perhaps why they are where they are, is an incredibly, it's a gift. It's an incredibly precious gift. I feel much closer to each one of my family members and even my parents' friends who were able to do that, because not only in that moment was I able to understand myself better, but I was able to understand parts of my own history, those two cultures. I felt less anxious in my space in the world. And also I felt sometimes in those conversations, people calming down, becoming more grounded. And that exchange is a really beautiful thing, to ask a question, to have somebody answer it, and to really sit and listen to them. As a journalist, I'm very lucky. I get to experience that quite a bit, but I do think there's a power to that alchemy almost.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neda. So I wanted to go to the next question, but because we were speaking about the journalism, I have one question about that journalism and then the community of that. We have Anthony and Nicole. Meriden, can you please open up that mic, and then if they wanted to speak for their question themselves, or I can read it if you prefer. Okay, I will. Okay, I will. I got a message that they prefer that I read it. So how do you think the journalism community, and especially those of the Iranian heritage like yourself, can help these brave young people bravely protesting, being imprisoned and tortured, and dying for their basic rights as women? Shouldn't this universal story deserve more attention than it's getting by the news?
Obviously, I would love it if people were covering it. My sense is, and I'm not obviously a news editor, but I know how news is, I know how that sausage is made. And I happen to have a robust journalism community of both people within that are Iranian, and then people who care about issues around Iran and other countries in the region. Yes, I don't want to say I think it's being perfectly covered. I think people are trying desperately to cover Iran as responsibly as possible, with all the information and misinformation out there, being able to verify accounts, and then also protect sources inside of Iran, and obviously, make sure some people have family, Iranian journalists. Like I was saying, I was talking to this Iranian journalist the other day who's really struggling with how he can both cover it, and maybe is now the time for him to give up the idea of ever going back to Iran. And I think that isn't something, I think a lot of people who aren't like me grew up being able to go back and forth. And so, I think for people who are in exile or have been in exile or have either self-imposed or otherwise, we've already said goodbye to Iran in so many different ways. But now we're asking young people, very young in some cases, people to give up all hope of going back to Iran. Seeing family, seeing their grandparents, seeing their aunts and uncles, it's a big question. And I think people are doing their best. Again, we are imperfect. And so I do think that that's part of it. On the like editorial side, I think, I mean, knowing background from some newsrooms, I think there have been journalists who've been trying desperately to get their staff to cover it. It's harder to cover stories when you can't get inside of countries. And right now, no one can get inside of Iran. So that makes it tricky. But even and still, I'm seeing more interesting stories coming out. People in Iran are putting themselves at great risk. I mean, to get any sort of stories, first person accounts out. And I'm not just talking about, Instagram or whatever. People are trying to reach out to journalists and trying to get information out. And it's tricky and it's really hard. So that is one of the things that I think is devastating also to watch, is to know that normal people can be very much in charge of somebody's live ability to walk down the street the next day. I mean, we're not going to be the reason why people are arrested, but we certainly could contribute to their getting arrested a lot faster. It's a lot of responsibility, I think. So there's a lot to be weighed, but yes, you're right. We could do more, always we could do more, but just also to know the other side, that there are groups of people trying desperately to get it in the front pages, proverbially or otherwise.
I think I agree with you. It's very tricky when you're dealing with something like a regime in Iran and then any risk around it. So I believe that the question is more about the news and not about the diaspora community of that.
Mm-hmm.
Because yes, you're right. It's those group of people, if they will be, if they are the voice of the people in Iran, then they are facing a bigger risk of not going back there or any things for their family. So that's very obvious. And I think another question it's just a question that not only news coming from Iran should be covered wider and better, but also the news outside of Iran. We had many gatherings all around the globe, and unfortunately, we didn't see many coverage in any of those medias or news to the point that they deserve.
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting part of what's happening now with the protests outside of Iran, which I can see a news editor or somebody becoming more interested in, is how long it's been going and how regularly it's been going. Because I also think, we live in a time where protests are, I mean, it's not enough just to gather, right? There's been enormous protests always. So what if I was, and I wish I was still in a newsroom. I'm not in an active newsroom right now, but if I was, my argument would be to get to be watching these protests over time outside of the country. And the protests are, I will say, fascinating for so many reasons. And maybe this is because I'm not part of any other diaspora community, but there's a lot going on within the protests that aren't just about Iran, what's happening in Iran. And I think that that's, something that we should all, be considering as we go forward.
Yeah. So, Dusan, can we open the mic for Miss Amiri, Nahid Amiri? Do you want to go through your question yourself, or do you rather me to read it? Okay, we have them on the call.
Okay. I'd rather you bring the question, and if the follow-up, maybe I.
Yeah, sure.
Please, thank you.
Thank you, Neda. Such an extraordinary memoir. Have you read any prison memoir in diaspora that you found interesting or informing?
That's a really great question, and I have a terrible answer because I meant to like quietly Google what this memoir was. But the truth is, I didn't read a lot of prison memoirs. Because I ended up trying to reconstruct what I thought the inside of where my dad was, and because it was in the past, what I did was spend a lot of time watching testimony from people who were held in Evin at the time. I watched, or around the same, within like 10 years. I read news accounts where I could. And so I tried to do more sort of primary source, but there is a memoir that came out that I thought was really just beautiful. Maybe somebody knows the name off the top of the head, like their head. I can see the cover of it, but it's this Iranian journalist, I believe, who is now being held in detention, or was being held in detention in Australia. It was the dark side of the mountain or something. Do you know?
Yes, it was. I think it was a Kurdish journalism. Who seeks
Iranian
asylum.
Kurdish.
Yes.
Yeah.
He wasn't in Australia. He went to Guinea and then applied for the asylum, and he was held over there because it was a yes. Yeah. Remember his name? I'm gonna search it.
Yeah, it came out for five years, maybe longer. What I found extraordinary as somebody who was writing a memoir was him writing he's a beautiful writer and all that, but also he wrote it over WhatsApp, which I have to tell you is like pretty extraordinary feat among other things. But I remember feeling very small and like I wasn't doing quite enough when I heard that. But I'm trying to think I did read, and I talked to people about so I mostly did journalism and talking to people about their experience in prison, but I didn't read a lot of prison memoirs in terms of like the stories like that came out about people being imprisoned in Evin. I didn't read a ton of them. I'd have to remember. I think I maybe checked some things. Like I was more concerned about getting as much correct about what the cells look like, what the layout of it was, and stuff like that. So,
okay. Behruz Buchani was his name.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm going to. So there's an anonymous question. Are you concerned about some concerted effort to rewrite the history of your parents' activism during the regime of the Pahlavis regime?
Am I concerned? I think I always get nervous when people decide which parts of their history they're going to pay attention to and which parts they aren't. I think one of the things that is maybe I'm trying to come to terms with it, but is like, everybody has that thing where they hear in the news when they're describing something and it's a pet peeve or whatever. I think my pet peeve is the idea that the 79 revolution was strictly Islamic, because that in my mind erases millions of people and decades of unhappiness, both warranted or, in some people's opinion, unwarranted. But I think by erasing it completely, again, that goes back to this idea of history repeating itself, or at least history rhyming. If you decide or choose not to see parts of your history, or to willfully ignore parts of your history, then you'll stumble sort of going into the future, I think.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. So my next question, let me just check really quickly. Okay, yeah, just I wanted to be respectful to the order of the question. And apologies if I miss anything in order. I'll do my best. So we are in a revolutionary movement now today. You wanted to understand why your parents wanted revolution and did a great job searching and explaining it, and your own feelings as well. At the end of the book, you talk about your child and what this book could mean to them. How about now? What do you want to tell your child about this revolution when they grow up to understand? And also, does it help you to understand your parents better?
Sorry, was the question asker, were they talking about this revolution that we're in now or the 79 revolution?
I think they meant the revolution and the changes that we're going through now.
I think it's hard to know what we're in the middle of history being written, right? I think right now I would tell him probably the same things I've said here. I mean, this is probably assuming, this is the only way I can imagine it is of other protest movements and other revolutions that have gone before. I think I will always be proud of a place like Tunisia, for example, for standing up. Whatever's happened since, we can argue about whether or not, the uprising in Egypt turned out the way people thought it was going to. But I am always going to I'm always going to be on the side of people who stand up and ask for their voices to be heard. And I think for my son, I would want him to operate always out of a place of kindness and integrity and dignity and uphold that in other people. And so where he sees people being erased or where he sees voices going without being heard, it's his obligation to make sure that people without privilege or with less privilege, people without voice, have him or somebody that are gonna clear the airwaves and let them speak in their own voice.
Yeah,
I hope that answers your question.
We have Jale Pirnazar, please.
Hi, Jale.
Hi, Aziza. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay. Neda, thank you so much for the presentation. Excellent. Thanks again for writing the book. It's very impressive to read. I knew both of your parents. I went to school with them, UC Berkeley, as undergrads, and we had plenty of fun times together and moments that I have cherished all my life. And you have captured that emotion and that particular period of carefree, idealistic, young, students, and at the same time, first love, and a lot of that going on. And at the same time, carrying a very heavy burden of responsibility to gain justice for our communities. So we felt that very heavily on our shoulders. And your parents chose the path that they chose, and the rest is very much history. And I'm very impressed with your writing. You write very well, by the way. And I'm feeling you got this as a gift from Farah. Farah wrote very well. She really was she was very clear both in her thoughts and in her expression, which was a gift, I think. My question for you is, I've read a number of memoirs written in the diaspora, mostly English publication. As you know, there's a lot of them. There's over 200 of them, I would say. And they each cover a variety of subjects. There are memoirs written from prison, memoirs. There are memoirs written about their adjustment of the writer here in this country and in the diaspora. And lately, we are seeing more and more memoirs written by a next generation that are being raised in this country with the ghosts of their parents, with the ghosts of the revolution, and at the same time, a totally unfamiliar upbringing in the United States because the parents are very unfamiliar with this particular culture and so on. Now, for you in particular, has writing this memoir been empowering in some ways to look forward and move on forward? Has this given you an agency that you've been looking for? Is this what you call a limbo land between America and Iran, and trying to locate yourself in this little niche that you find yourself? And I would personally call your writings and others like you who are writing about the past of their parents, and trying to figure out how to find a roadmap to move on forward. I would call this American ethnic writings. In other words, writings that belong to an ethnic population, all American. I mean, there's no doubt about, the limbo, I think, is much more clear for me. It's not so much Iran and America, it's America. It's America, it's culture of multi-ethnicity, right? So you kind of belong to that period. Your writings, like many from other ethnic backgrounds, I mean, we're all familiar with a lot of the Chinese American writings, for example. Some of them have won tremendous recognition and so on. So your writings would probably belong to this opening, and we as Iranian Americans, we're opening up this road as we move forward. What do you think? What are your thoughts?
I'm sorry, my son just came running into this room. Yes, I mean, my thoughts are I think that's like to break up the question a little bit, I found the process of writing this book, it's interesting. To me, this book resonates with a couple of different groups of people, but one of them is sort of the classic coming of age people who are at that time in their life where they're trying to figure out who they are and where they're going, which makes sense, so a lot of my friends whose kids are in college have really responded to it for, I think, obvious reasons. And then, an older generation, or I say older, like my parents' generation, your generation, and my generation brings a different thing. I think it took me a long time to realize that this was a book about grief, almost as much as anything else. And it wasn't just, obviously it may seem obvious that the grieving was about my parents. I think that the book was also about grieving, as you say, this idea of ever being Iranian the way that maybe I should have been, like we escaped Iran. My family, both sides, is Iranian. I'm not, that part of me isn't, it isn't a mixed culture that way for me. My family have for generations, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, were Iranian. And so I don't have that connection. It wasn't a slow break. It was a hard break for me and my brother. And my brother and I, by the way, are in two different worlds. Like I still sort of have a different kind of connection with Iran. And my brother, now in his 40s, is starting to figure out where he stands and where his Iranianness begins and his Americanness ends. But I take it as, I think the literature that I most responded to when I was writing this was straight memoir, but Southern memoirs, as in American South. And then, in college, I studied Vietnam Wars. So I read a lot of Vietnamese American memoirs and Chinese memoirs as well. Because I think there were similar frictions and breaks in sort of people's relationship with their cultures. And also we're broadly all, of an Asian background. So there was similarities there. But yeah, I think my other sort of, hope or suggestion is that you mentioned there's 200 memoirs. It was really hard for me to sell this book. It took many, many years. And I sort of thought because there were so many Iranian writers and that meant that people were interested. And what I found over and over again, that publishing houses thought that Iran books don't sell. So, and that people don't care about Iranians. Americans or whomever, white people don't care about Iranians. And I haven't found that to be true. So my hope is that you guys will go out and tell people that we should be publishing more Iranian authors, Iranian-American authors, Iranian diaspora authors, because it's hard out there for us trying to make our way in this literary world. Jala June, did that answer your question at all? I'm sorry if I'm not being.
Oh yeah. I'm very impressed. And also, as a last comment, I would like to say that you're writing the memoir about your parents and all that is, as far as a literary aspect of it, I look at it as a daughter in search of her father.
A lot of people have said that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's certainly that element in it. And I think you have found him, or you have found his essence. And I hope that brings a resolution for your grief so that you can move on in life.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Going back to our previous question, I think the last part of it remained. So the question, the last part of it was that with all the things happening now in Iran, the revolutionary atmosphere and all that comes with it, does it help you to understand your parents and what they felt better?
I think yes and no. I mean, part of it, I do feel like another theme of this talk is imperfection. I understand that I knew my mother pretty well, and especially when she was sick, we spent a lot of time talking and going through things. So I feel like as much as this was a search for my dad, it was also very much, I think now I would be able to focus more on my mother than I would at the start of the process. It was so close to my mom having passed and me having watched her, get sicker. But we spent so many hours and days walking and talking about the past. And my brother spent a lot of time interviewing her. So I feel very confident to the extent that I can with acknowledging that no matter how much we try to speak clearly and use the right words, the misunderstandings are inevitable. So on my mom's side, I feel good, relatively speaking, where I think that there's stuff that she might not have super loved. I still feel like she would have understood where I was coming from. My dad, I can only do my best. The one thing I know for sure is that, and this isn't always a good thing, but I tried very hard to be fair and very hard to give everybody in this book as much benefit of the doubt as possible. And so I would hope that in my parents, wherever they are, would do the same. But I have the other, I don't think I feel as, I don't feel as sad now. That sounds so simple, but I don't feel as sad. A lot of, again, the storytelling and story collecting integrated a lot of this into my body. I have other things that keep me up at night, is the good news, but at least it's not that. It's not old wounds in the same way.
All right. I hope that question was answered, but please feel free to, if you have any follow-up question, to let me know. So far, I have my last question from the audience, and I wanted to ask if ST wants to ask the question themselves. Can we open that mic? Okay. Thank you. Okay. I think we have you. If you can just unmute yourself. Okay. Well, I can read the question. It seems you try to be as correct as possible in retelling the events. What was the hardest to bring those on the paper?
I think there were lots of, there's stuff that felt very hard to recreate because I was trying desperately to be as accurate as possible, but also knowing that I was never going to be perfect. And then knowing that in some cases, it was important that people were telling me their story. And so it became, as long as the events, I obviously checked everything, but like, I wasn't going to erase people from stories that they told me to the extent that that was possible while protecting people as much as I could. I think the hardest thing was trying to there was a lot of hard things, but one of the hardest things was trying to figure out my parents' love story without them being around and having to find clues from various people. Because my mother had only told me one side, right? And she had been dead for many years at that point. And then the other hard part was figuring out my dad's life or some part of my dad's life in Missouri, because no one really knew. And so it was moments like that I felt like I really struggled to do the best I could. And that meant, for example, going to Missouri, spending time with archivists, for my mom, and then allowing, forcing myself to sometimes doubt narratives that I've known all my life. And that sometimes led me to more interesting things. So an example is my mom always told me how unhappy she was in high school. And so one way of doing it would have just been being able to say, my mother was unhappy in high school and hated Monterey, done. But I felt like it was important that I went to Monterey and I was able to kind of walk into the high school, and the archivists, librarians, and the administrators there let me look through her records and through old yearbooks. And I was able to find pictures of not just her, but of people that she had told stories about. And so all of a sudden, this sort of one-dimensional black and white story, and a lot of this was cut from the book, but I understood my mother in a different way, and also was able to see some of the ways that we are stagnant. Mom told one version of the story about her having no friends or whatever, and maybe that was true, but she was still in all of these clubs, for example, in her high school, as an example. Or she told me the story about this woman, this young girl who died when in her high school, and it was very different seeing the girl, for example. Anyway, so these were all things that I tried desperately to do my best. And it was all hard. These are essentially, I was a story collector. And so that feeling like I was earning people's stories felt very, that weighed on me.
Yeah, thank you, Neda. I'd like to thank you, and I wanted to just wrap up our today's session with something from your book again. So we started our day with the women movement, and in a broader view, a young generation who seeks, if not another revolution, but for sure a revolutionary change. And now I'd like to close it with the remembering of the generation who actually participated in and made 1979's revolution happen. After 1979 revolution, especially when it was changed and called Islamic Republic, There were so many regrets for participating in that movement, for making that change happen. And since then, there have been many blames from the next generations questioning what have they done, why did I do that, what did I think. Over the last 40 years, many like your father got assassinated and killed by regime, and many like mine lived long enough carrying shame, rage, disappointment, and witnessing the fall of their dreamy revolution and living through the darkest days of their life. I believe it's vital to read and learn from the history, our history, to understand, not only our history, to understand why things happen and what was or what is the motive behind it, or else being doomed to repeat it. To understand who they were, their motives and their intention, I'd like to ask you to read your father's will for us. I'd like us to hear that generation out and appreciate the bravery and, more important, their pure and innocent dream of change. I'd like us to deeply understand what they meant when they said they wanted revolution.
Evin Prison, Tehran, January 1983. In the name of God. Today, January 24th, 1983, I, Neda Toloui-Semnani, received my death sentence. And as my last writing, I am writing a few lines to my relatives, my kind parents, my dear wife, and my small and beautiful children, Neda and Nima, and other acquaintances and friends. Anyone who chooses to walk a certain path must accept all its consequences. First, his intention is important, and people must partially judge him on that. Then it is his actions that must be the basis for others to remember and to evaluate him. I too must be judged based on these two things. I stepped into this path and did everything with a sacred intention at heart. Yet I make no claims on its success, except that I was part of it. I would in nothing but the complete freedom and independence of Iran. I acted not to betray, but to serve my country. You also know I was against the uprising in Amol and opposed to it. But as a member of the organization, I have to accept the consequences, and I have. I deeply apologize for putting you through this and ask God to grant you strength and patience, since I'll be freed and the sorrow is left to you. Mother and father, please know that I received nothing but love and kindness from you, and I can never forget, which I can never forget. I only seek your forgiveness. My dear Farah, my loyal wife, please know that I spent many happy and fruitful years with you. What I got from you has been kindness, love, and pleasure. Even though at times I took you for granted and caused you pain and anger, I hope you'll forgive me. My dear Neda and Nima, my dear little Neda, Nima, who I have not yet met or seen a picture of, I hope when the time is right, Farah and the family will tell you about my life, legacy, and death. Please know that I have not been after power for myself and only intended to serve my people and my country. I hope you remember me that way and learn from my mistakes so that you can become a worthy and good person for your country and faith. I wish you happiness and success. I'm going to skip the part where he goes through his debts. To my mother, father, I put a bunch of blanks in there, Farah, Neda, Nima, and on and on. Don't hold any anger or grudge against the Islamic Republic. The government must be strong from inside in order to fight Western imperialism and an aggressive Soviet Union. In recent years, different Iranian organizations have acted against the Republic based on their own beliefs and desires. Without exception, Marxists acted against the government. We were one such group. Even if a person has not personally fought against the Islamic Republic, the Islamic government, he must take responsibility for the actions of his entire organization. This was the case for me. After this, may the society and the great people of Iran achieve more unity, victory, and happiness. I believed in and have a special love for the leader of the revolution, Imam Khomeini. Many victories were achieved because of the existence of such a character, the revolution and the Islamic Republic. I hope God protects him for the revolution and for the hardworking people of Iran. I apologize for the sorrow and pain I caused you and ask you to forgive me and pray to God for my forgiveness. I send you my love. I ask you not to cry for me, to hold your heads up and know that I don't have the slightest fear of death. At last, sooner or later, we will all die. It's not very complicated. And we shall meet again. The son, the brother, the husband, the father, and your friend, dear ones. Memoirs Toloui-Semnani.
Merci, Neda. I think it's very to me your book is amazing and I really like it. And there were so many part of it was hard even for me to just listen. I mean, I listened to the audible version of it, which I'm glad that I did that because it's with your voice. So I could feel your emotion through those lines. I'm happy to do that. That I did that. And this section was also very emotional for me because it just showed me how innocent the revolutionary people were at that time, what they thought about everything that's going on in the country and their hope and dream for the future and what exactly actually happened in the entire dark part of it. So thank you so much for accepting our invite and then being our guest today in this special moment that we are living right now. And I'd like to thank every single one of the audience and our friends to join us today. I like to finish our session with, of course, a very famous and unique song that we are hearing these days. Thank you so much.
برای توی کوچه رقصیدن، برای ترسیدن به وقت بوسیدن، برای خواهرم، خواهرت، خواهرامون، برای تغییر مغزها که پوسیدن، برای شرمندگی، برای بیپولی، برای حسرت یک زندگی معمولی، برای کودک سوالگرد و آرزوهاش، برای این اقتصاد دستوری، برای این هوای آلوده، برای ولیعصر و درختای فرسوده، برای پیروز و احتمال انقراضش، برای سگهای بیگناه ممنوعه، برای گریه های بیوقفه، برای تصویر تکرار این لحظه، برای چهره‌ای که میخنده، برای دانش آموزا، برای آینده، برای این بهشت اجباری، برای نخبه های زندانی، برای کودکان افغانی، برای این همه برای غیر تکراری، برای این همه شعارهای تو خالی، برای آوار خونه های پوشالی، برای احساس آرامش، برای خورشید پس از شبای طولانی، برای قرصای اعصاب و بیخوابی، برای مرد میهن آبادی، برای دختری که آرزو داشت پسر بود، برای زن زندگی آزادی، برای آزادی.